I was on a guided safari in South Africa, excited to see the wildlife up close. We were in a large group, riding in an open-top jeep, with our guide explaining the different animals and plants. The sun was shining, and the air was filled with the sounds of birds and insects. I had my camera ready, hoping to capture some great shots. We stopped at a clearing to take some photos of a herd of elephants in the distance. Our guide told us to stay close, but I wandered a bit to get a better angle. I didn't realize how far I had gone until I couldn't hear the voices of the group anymore. When I turned around, the jeep was gone. Panic set in as I realized I was alone. I started walking in the direction I thought they had gone, but the landscape looked the same in every direction. The sun was beginning to set, and I knew I needed to find them before dark. My heart was pounding, and I felt the fear rising. I shouted for help, but there was no response. As I was walking, I heard voices. Relieved, I headed towards the sound, thinking I had found my group. But as I got closer, I realized these were not the voices of my fellow tourists. These were rough, angry voices speaking in a language I didn't understand. I crouched behind some bushes and peered through the leaves. I saw a group of men with rifles, standing around a jeep. They were talking heatedly and gesturing towards something on the ground. My blood ran cold when I saw the carcass of a rhinoceros, its horn sawed off. These were poachers, and they had just killed the animal. I knew I had to get away before they saw me. I started to back away slowly, but I stepped on a dry twig, and it snapped loudly. One of the men turned towards the sound. I froze, hoping he wouldn't see me. But he did. He shouted to the others, and they all looked in my direction. I bolted, running as fast as I could through the dense brush. I could hear them shouting and the sound of their footsteps behind me. My mind was racing, trying to think of a way out. I knew if they caught me, I wouldn't survive. I stumbled through the undergrowth, branches scratching my face and arms. I could hear them getting closer, their voices growing louder. My lungs were burning, but I couldn't stop. I spotted a large tree with low branches and scrambled up, hoping they wouldn't see me. I held my breath, trying to stay as still as possible. The men ran past, not noticing me hidden in the foliage. I waited until I couldn't hear their voices anymore before climbing down. I knew I couldn't stay there. They would come back and find me. I started moving again, more cautiously this time. I kept to the shadows, trying to stay hidden. The sun had set completely, and the darkness made it even harder to navigate. I tripped over roots and rocks, my fear growing with each passing minute. Eventually, I heard the sound of running water. I followed it, thinking it might lead me to safety. I found a small stream and drank deeply, trying to calm my nerves. I sat by the water, trying to think of my next move. My mind was clouded with fear and exhaustion. As I sat there, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching. I looked around frantically, trying to find a place to hide. But it was too late. The poachers had found me. They surrounded me, their faces twisted with anger. One of them grabbed me by the arm and yanked me to my feet. He shouted something in my face, but I couldn't understand. He pointed his rifle at me, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me. I thought this was the end. But then, I heard another voice shouting in the distance. The poachers looked up, their expressions changing from anger to fear. I realized it was the voice of my guide, calling out for me. The poachers exchanged glances and then fled into the night. Moments later, my guide and the rest of the group burst through the trees. They were shouting my name, and I cried out in relief. The guide ran over to me, asking if I was okay. I was shaking, but I managed to nod. We made our way back to the jeep, and I couldn't stop shaking. The guide explained that they had noticed I was missing and had been searching for me. I told them about the poachers, and the guide reported it to the authorities. That night, back at the lodge, I couldn't sleep. The fear and adrenaline were still coursing through me. I kept thinking about how close I had come to not making it out alive. The experience had shaken me to my core. The authorities assured us they would investigate the poachers, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I was grateful to be safe, but I knew I would never forget the terror of that night in the South African wilderness. I was traveling through India, exploring the remote areas that tourists usually avoid. I had always been fascinated by the less traveled paths, the hidden gems. One day, I decided to visit a remote temple that I had read about in a travel blog. It was deep in the forest, far from any village or town. The journey itself was an adventure, navigating through narrow, winding roads surrounded by dense trees. When I finally arrived, the temple stood silent and majestic. It was ancient, with intricate carvings and a serene atmosphere. I felt a sense of peace as I walked around, taking in the beauty and the history. I was the only visitor there, which made the experience even more special. I spent hours exploring every corner, lost in my thoughts and the tranquility of the place. As the sun began to set, I realized I needed to head back to my guest house. I started walking towards the parking area where I had left my rental car. Suddenly, I heard a rustling in the bushes. I turned around, but saw nothing. I shrugged it off and continued walking, but the uneasy feeling in my gut remained. Out of nowhere, a group of men emerged from the trees. They were dressed in simple clothes, but their faces were covered with scarves, only their eyes visible. They surrounded me, and I could see the anger and determination in their eyes. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of what was happening. One of them stepped forward, speaking rapidly in a language I couldn't understand. Before I could react, they grabbed me and forced me to the ground. My mind was in a frenzy, trying to think of a way out, but there was no escape. They tied my hands and blindfolded me, then dragged me through the forest. I tried to scream, but one of them gagged me. I felt helpless and terrified, not knowing where they were taking me or what they wanted. After what felt like hours, we stopped. They removed the blindfold and gag, and I found myself in a small, dark room with a dirt floor. It looked like an old shed, I couldn't be sure. They tied me to a chair and left, locking the door behind them. I was alone, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Hours passed, maybe even days. I had no sense of time. They brought me food and water, but never spoke to me. I tried to talk to them, to understand why they had taken me, but they ignored me. The silence and isolation were maddening. I felt like I was losing my mind. One day, one of the men entered the room. He spoke English, which was a small relief. He told me that they were part of a group fighting against the government. They planned to use me as a bargaining chip to get their demands met. My fear turned to dread as I realized I was just a pawn in a dangerous game. They recorded a video, forcing me to read a statement they had written. I could barely hold the paper. My hands were shaking so much. They sent the video to the authorities, demanding the release of their imprisoned comrades. I felt like my life was hanging by a thread, completely at their mercy. Days turned into weeks. The waiting was the worst part. I could hear them outside, discussing plans and arguing. I tried to stay hopeful, but it was hard. Every time the door opened, I feared it was my end. My thoughts were a constant swirl of fear and desperation. One night, I heard a commotion outside. Shouts and gunfire echoed through the forest. My heart pounded as I realized something was happening. The door burst open and a group of soldiers stormed in. They were Indian Army, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. They untied me and helped me outside. The extremists had been captured or killed. I was safe, but the ordeal had left me shaken to my core. The soldiers took me to a nearby village where I received medical attention and contacted my family. The relief I felt was overwhelming, but the trauma lingered. I returned home, but the memories of that time haunted me. The fear, the isolation, the helplessness, it was all too real. I tried to move on, but every now and then, I would have nightmares, reliving the terror of being captured and held against my will. It was an experience that changed me forever. I had always wanted to hike the Swiss Alps. It was a dream of mine. So, when I finally saved enough money, I took a solo trip. I had read so much about the trails and the stunning views. I couldn't wait to experience it all firsthand. The first few days were everything I hoped for. The air was fresh, the scenery was breathtaking, and I felt free. On the fourth day, I decided to take a less traveled path. I thought it would be nice to avoid the usual tourist spots. The trail was steep and rocky, but I was prepared. At least, I thought I was. About halfway through the day, I slipped on a wet rock and twisted my ankle badly. The pain shot through my leg, and I couldn't put any weight on it. I was alone, miles away from the nearest village, with no cell signal. I tried to keep calm. I knew I had to find help or shelter for the night. Hobbling along, using a stick for support, I stumbled upon a small cabin. Relief washed over me. I knocked on the door, hoping someone would be inside. After a moment, a man opened the door. He was in his mid-40s, with a rugged look and piercing eyes. He seemed concerned when he saw me. I told him about my ankle, and he invited me in. The cabin was small but cozy, with a fire burning in the fireplace. He introduced himself as Hans and said he lived there alone. He offered to take a look at my ankle. I hesitated but eventually agreed, but pain too intense to refuse help. Hans examined my ankle and said it was badly sprained. He wrapped it in a bandage and gave me some painkillers. I was grateful and felt a bit more at ease. He said I could stay the night and he'd help me get to a doctor in the morning. Exhausted and in pain, I accepted his offer. That night, I slept in a small room at the back of the cabin. I woke up several times, my ankle throbbing, but also feeling a strange unease. Something about Hans didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was his intense gaze or the way he watched me a little too closely. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just my paranoia from being in a strange place. In the morning, Hans brought me breakfast and asked how I was feeling. I thanked him and said I was ready to leave as soon as possible. But he seemed to avoid the subject, talking instead about the weather and the mountains. My unease grew, but I was stuck. I couldn't walk far on my own, and I had no way to call for help. As the day went on, Hans's demeanor changed. He became more controlling, not letting me out of his sight. I asked again about getting to a doctor, and he got angry, saying it wasn't safe to travel yet. Panic started to set in. I realized I was trapped in the cabin with a man I knew nothing about, and I had no way to escape. The next night, I pretended to sleep, hoping to find a chance to sneak out. But Hans never went to bed. He stayed up, watching me from the living room. I could see the outline of his figure against the dim light of the fire. Every time I moved, his head turned towards me. I felt a cold fear creeping over me. In the morning, I decided to confront him. I told him I needed to leave, but I couldn't stay any longer. His response was chilling. He said I wasn't going anywhere until he decided it was safe. His eyes had a wild look, and I knew I had to find a way out, fast. I waited until he went to the outhouse behind the cabin. I limped to the door, my heart pounding, and tried to open it quietly. It was locked. Hans must have locked it from the outside. Desperation set in. I looked around for anything I could use to defend myself or break a window, but there was nothing. When Hans came back, he saw me near the door and smiled, a knowing smile that sent chills down my spine. He didn't say anything, just sat by the fire and watched me. The days blurred together after that. He kept me in the room, bringing me food and water but never letting me out of his sight. My ankle slowly healed, but the psychological terror was worse than the physical pain. I knew I had to make a move. One night, when Hans fell asleep in his chair by the fire, I found a small, rusty knife in the kitchen. It wasn't much, but it was my only chance. I waited, barely breathing, until I was sure he was deeply asleep. Then, I crept towards the door and managed to pick the lock with the knife. It took what felt like forever, every tiny noise making me jump. Finally, the lock clicked open. I slipped outside, the cold night air hitting me like a wall. I hobbled as fast as I could down the trail, not daring to look back. I heard a shout from the cabin and knew Hans had woken up. Panic gave me strength, and I pushed through the pain, moving faster than I thought possible. I reached a small village at dawn. The locals were shocked to see me, disheveled and in tears. They helped me to the nearest clinic, and I told them everything. The authorities were called, and they went to the cabin, but Hans was gone. They found evidence of other victims, though, people who had never been reported missing because they were travelers like me, far from home. I made it back home, but the experience left deep scars. The fear, the helplessness, it all stayed with me. I had always been fascinated by ancient civilizations, so when I got the chance to join an archaeological dig in Egypt, I jumped at it. The dig site was near the Nile, not far from Luxor. It was an incredible opportunity, and I was eager to uncover pieces of history buried in the sand. The first few weeks were exciting but exhausting, as we worked long hours under the scorching sun. One afternoon, I was digging in a secluded part of the site when my trowel hit something solid. At first, I thought it was just another piece of pottery, but as I carefully uncovered it, I realized it was a small wooden box, intricately carved. My heart raced with excitement as I lifted it out of the ground. I called over my colleague, Dr. Ahmed, to take a look. Dr. Ahmed examined the box, his eyes widening. He said it looked like it might be from the late period of ancient Egypt, or rare find. We decided to open it carefully back at our makeshift lab. Inside, we found several small, well-preserved artifacts, jewelry, coins, and a few scrolls. It was an incredible discovery, one that could shed light on a lesser-known period of Egyptian history. That night, we celebrated our find with the rest of the team. Everyone was excited, and there was talk of contacting the authorities to document and secure the artifacts. But later, as I was packing up my tools, Dr. Ahmed pulled me aside. He looked worried and told me to keep quiet about the box for now. He had a feeling something wasn't right. Over the next few days, I noticed a few strangers hanging around the site. They didn't seem like tourists or locals, and they were definitely not part of our team. One evening, I overheard them talking in hushed tones near our camp. I couldn't make out everything, but I caught enough to know they were interested in the artifacts we had found. I confided in Dr. Ahmed about what I had heard. He looked even more concerned and told me he suspected they might be part of a smuggling ring. He had encountered similar situations before, where valuable artifacts were stolen and sold on the black market. He warned me to be careful and keep an eye on the box at all times. Things took a turn for the worse when, one night, I woke up to find the box missing from our lab. Panic set in. I rushed to Dr. Ahmed's tent, only to find it ransacked and nowhere in sight. Fear gripped me as I realized the smugglers had taken him, probably to force him to reveal the location of other valuable artifacts. I knew I had to act fast. I packed a small bag with essentials and decided to head to the nearest town to get help. As I slipped out of the camp, I heard voices behind me. I looked back and saw the same strangers, now armed and searching the area. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept through the darkness, trying to stay out of sight. I managed to make it to the edge of the camp and started towards the town, which was several miles away. The desert night was cold and eerie, with only the sound of my footsteps breaking the silence. After what felt like hours, I heard a vehicle approaching. I hid behind a dune, my heart racing, as a jeep drove past, its headlights scanning the area. I waited until the jeep was out of sight before continuing. My mind was racing with thoughts of Dr. Ahmed and what the smugglers might do to him. I had to find help, but I also had to avoid getting caught. The town was still a long way off, and I was already exhausted. Just as dawn was breaking, I reached the outskirts of the town. I headed straight for the local police station, hoping they would believe my story and act quickly. The officer on duty listened intently as I explained the situation. He seemed skeptical at first but agreed to send a few men to investigate. While we waited for the police to mobilize, I tried to contact Dr. Ahmed's family to let them know what was happening. They were understandably frantic and urged the police to act quickly. I felt a small sense of relief knowing that help was on the way, but I couldn't shake the fear that it might be too late. The police and I returned to the dig site in a convoy of vehicles. As we approached, we saw the smuggler's jeep parked near the entrance. The officers moved in quickly, surrounding the area and securing the site. After a tense search, they found Dr. Ahmed tied up in one of the tents, but thankfully unharmed. The smugglers were arrested, and the stolen artifacts were recovered. Dr. Ahmed and I gave our statements, detailing everything that had happened. It was a harrowing experience, one that left me shaken and questioning my decision to join the dig in the first place. In the days that followed, the site was secured, and additional measures were put in place to protect the artifacts. The local authorities worked with our team to ensure that everything was properly documented and preserved. Dr. Ahmed and I were hailed as heroes for uncovering the smuggling ring, but the ordeal had left its mark. I continued with the dig, but the excitement I once felt was now tinged with caution. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and every shadow seemed to hold a potential threat. The beauty of the ancient ruins was still there, but my view of the world had changed. I was on a cruise in the Caribbean, hoping to unwind and enjoy some time away from work. The ship was massive, almost like a floating city, with everything you could imagine on board. My cabin was on one of the lower decks, but it was cozy and had a small porthole that looked out onto the endless sea. One evening, after dinner, I decided to take a walk around the ship. It was quiet. Most passengers were at the theater or in the various lounges. I wandered through the corridors, enjoying the peace. The ship felt almost deserted in some areas, which I liked. It gave me time to think. As I walked past one of the smaller lounges, I heard raised voices. Curious, I slowed down and peeked through the small window on the door. Inside, I saw two men arguing. One of them was tall and had a menacing look, the other looked scared. They were speaking in hushed tones, but their body language told me something was very wrong. Suddenly, the taller man grabbed the other by the throat and slammed him against the wall. I froze, my heart pounding. I watched in horror as the tall man pulled out a knife and plunged it into the other man's chest. The victim's eyes went wide with terror before he crumpled to the floor. I stumbled back, a gasp escaping my lips. The killer's head snapped towards the door. I saw his eyes lock onto mine through the window. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran down the corridor, my footsteps echoing off the walls. I could hear the door to the lounge burst open behind me. I didn't dare look back. I sprinted through the maze of hallways, trying to remember the layout of the ship. My heart was beating so fast I thought it might explode. I needed to find somewhere to hide, somewhere he wouldn't find me. I turned a corner and saw a maintenance closet. Without thinking, I dove inside and closed the door as quietly as I could. I crouched in the dark, trying to control my breathing. I heard footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. He was searching for me. I covered my mouth with my hand, tears streaming down my face. The footsteps stopped right outside the closet. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't open the door. Minutes felt like hours as I waited. Finally, I heard him move away. I waited a bit longer, just to be sure, and cautiously opened the door and peeked out. The corridor was empty. I slipped out and headed in the opposite direction, my mind racing. I needed to find security or the captain, someone who could help. I made my way to the upper decks, sticking to the shadows. The ship was still eerily quiet. I passed a few passengers, but they were absorbed in their own conversations, oblivious to my terror. I finally reached the security office, only to find it empty. Panic set in again. Where was everyone? I decided to head to the bridge. Surely the captain would be there. I moved as quickly and quietly as I could, every sound making me jump. When I reached the bridge, I found the door slightly ajar. I slipped inside, but to my horror, it was empty too. Desperation clawed at me. I was alone. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me. I turned to see the killer standing in the doorway, his knife glinting in the dim light. "Thought you could hide from me?" he sneered. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. My back hit the control panel, and I felt a cold sweat break out. "Please," I whispered, my voice shaking. "You don't have to do this." He just smiled, a cold, merciless smile. "But I do," he said, taking a step closer. I looked around frantically, my eyes landing on the ship's intercom. Without thinking, I grabbed the microphone and screamed, "Help! Murder on the bridge!" The killer lunged at me, but I ducked just in time. He swung the knife, but it missed me by inches. I grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher and swung it at him with all my strength. It connected with his head, and he stumbled back, dazed. I didn't wait to see if he recovered. I bolted out of the bridge and down the nearest stairwell. I could hear shouts and footsteps above me. My call for help had been heard. Relief flooded through me as I ran towards the main deck. Security officers were rushing towards the bridge. I flagged them down, breathless and trembling. "He's up there," I managed to say. "He's got a knife." They nodded and continued up the stairs, weapons drawn. I sank to the floor, my whole body shaking. Passengers gathered around, asking what happened, but I couldn't speak. The reality of what I'd witnessed and narrowly escaped from was too much to process. Minutes later, I heard a commotion as the officers subdued the killer. They led him away in handcuffs, his face bruised and bleeding. He glared at me as they passed, but I knew he couldn't hurt me now. The passengers and crew members who had gathered around cheered as he was taken away. One of the officers helped me to my feet and took me to the medical bay. A doctor checked me over, and another officer took my statement. I recounted everything I had seen and experienced, my voice shaking but determined. I wanted to make sure they understood the danger this man posed. As the adrenaline wore off, exhaustion hit me like a wave. The ship's crew arranged for me to stay in a different cabin, away from where the attack had happened. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, my mind replaying the events over and over. By morning, the ship's captain came to see me. He apologized profusely for what had happened and assured me that the killer was locked up and would be handed over to the authorities as soon as we docked. He also praised my bravery, but I didn't feel brave. I just felt lucky to be alive. The rest of the cruise was a blur. The other passengers were kind, but I kept to myself, needing time to process what had happened. When we finally docked, I was more than ready to leave the ship behind. The memory of that night would stay with me forever, but I was determined not to let it define me. As I stepped off the ship, I took a deep breath of the salty sea air and felt a sense of relief. I was free, and I was alive. That was all that mattered. I was driving through the Canadian Rockies, enjoying the solitude and the breathtaking scenery. It was supposed to be a peaceful trip, just me and the open road. The mountains were covered in snow, and the trees looked like they were straight out of a postcard. The roads were mostly empty, which was perfect for clearing my mind. It was late afternoon when I saw him, a lone figure on the side of the road, thumb out. He was bundled up against the cold, looking desperate. I hesitated for a moment, but then I decided to stop. It was freezing, and I couldn't just leave him out there. I pulled over and rolled down my window. "Need a ride?" I asked. He nodded, looking relieved. "Yes, please. Thank you so much." I unlocked the passenger door, and he climbed in, bringing a blast of cold air with him. He was young, maybe in his late 20s, with a rugged look. His clothes were dirty and worn, like he'd been on the road for a while. "Where are you headed?" I asked as we started moving again. "Just up the road a bit," he said, his voice a little shaky. "Anywhere is fine, really. I just need to get out of the cold." We drove in silence for a while. He kept looking out the window, glancing back at the road behind us every few minutes. Something about his behavior put me on edge. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was just being paranoid. After about an hour, we reached a small gas station. I needed to fill up, so I pulled in. As I got out to pump the gas, I noticed a police car parked at the edge of the lot. The officer inside was watching us. My passenger saw it too and tensed up. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He nodded quickly. "Yeah, just not a fan of cops." I paid for the gas and we got back on the road. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the snow. My passenger seemed more anxious now, fidgeting in his seat. I could feel the tension growing between us. Suddenly, he turned to me. "I need you to keep driving, no matter what. Don't stop for anything." "What's going on?" I asked, my heart starting to race. "Just do it," he insisted, his voice rising. "Please." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. A few minutes later, I saw the flashing lights of a police car in my rearview mirror. The officer was signaling for us to pull over. My passenger's face went pale. "Drive," he shouted. "Don't stop." Panic surged through me, but I didn't want any trouble with the law. I slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. The police car stopped behind us, and the officer got out, hand on his gun. My passenger's hand shot out, grabbing my arm. "No," he yelled. "Go." In a split second, I made the decision to hit the gas. The car lurched forward, tires squealing on the icy road. The police car followed, lights and sirens blaring. My heart was pounding in my chest as I sped down the highway, the cop close behind. Why are they after you? I shouted over the noise. Just keep driving, he screamed back. The chase went on for what felt like forever. We weaved through the mountains, the police car never far behind. My passenger was shouting directions, telling me where to turn, trying to lose the cop. The roads were getting narrower, more treacherous. Finally, we hit a stretch of road that was barely more than a dirt path. The police car fell back, unable to keep up on the rough terrain. I kept driving, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. When I was sure we had lost him, I slowed down and pulled over. Now tell me what's going on, I demanded, turning to face him. He looked defeated, slumping in his seat. I'm wanted, he admitted. I escaped from a prison transport. They were taking me to a high-security facility. I couldn't let them lock me up for something I didn't do. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. You're a fugitive. He nodded. I didn't kill anyone. They framed me. I was trying to get to a friend's place. He has evidence that can clear my name. I didn't know if I could believe him, but something in his eyes made me want to trust him. I was in too deep now. I had to see this through. Where do we go from here? I asked, my voice trembling. Keep driving, he said. I'll tell you where to go. We drove through the night, the tension in the car thick enough to cut with a knife. I kept glancing in the mirrors, expecting to see the flashing lights of a police car any minute. But the road remained dark and empty. By morning, we reached a small cabin tucked away in the woods. My passenger directed me to pull up behind it, out of sight from the road. We got out, and he led me inside. The place was a mess, but it looked like someone had been living there. Wait here, he said. I need to make a call. He disappeared into another room, leaving me alone. I sat on the edge of a worn-out couch, my mind racing. What had I gotten myself into? I was harboring a fugitive. If the police found us, I'd be in just as much trouble as he was. After what felt like an eternity, he came back, a relieved look on his face. My friend is coming to get us. He's bringing the evidence. We just need to stay hidden until then. Hours passed. The sun was high in the sky when we heard the sound of a car approaching. My heart leaped into my throat. He peeked out the window and nodded. It's him. A man got out of the car, carrying a briefcase. He looked around nervously before hurrying to the door. My passenger let him in, and they embraced like old friends. You made it, the newcomer said. I've got everything we need. They opened the briefcase, revealing stacks of papers and a laptop. They started going through the documents, talking in hushed tones. I watched, feeling like an outsider in my own nightmare. Finally, they turned to me. We're going to send this to the media, my passenger said. Once it's out there, they can't ignore the truth. We need your help. I agreed, not knowing what else to do. They worked quickly, scanning documents and sending emails. The sun was setting again by the time they were finished. We have to move, the friend said. It won't be long before they find us here. We packed up and got back in the car. My passenger sat beside me, the friend in the back. We drove in silence, the weight of what we were doing pressing down on us. We reached a small town just as night fell, finding a cheap motel to hide out in. The next few days were a blur. The story broke, and it was everywhere. The evidence proved my passenger's innocence. The police were looking for us, but now they were on our side. We were heroes. I felt like I had barely survived a nightmare. When it was over, and he was cleared, he thanked me. You saved my life, he said. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. I had done what I thought was right, and in the end, it had all worked out. But I knew I would never forget those terrifying days on the run, and the man who had dragged me into his desperate fight for freedom. I had always wanted to visit Morocco. The vibrant colors, bustling markets, and rich history fascinated me. So, I decided to take the trip alone, hoping for an adventure. Everything started off great. The people were friendly, the food was amazing, and I felt safe exploring the cities. One day, while wandering through the narrow streets of Marrakesh, a man approached me. He was middle-aged, well-dressed, and spoke fluent English. He introduced himself as Hassan, a local tour guide. He seemed friendly and knowledgeable, and he offered to show me some places that tourists usually miss. I hesitated at first, but then thought it would be a great way to see more of the country. We planned to visit a village in the desert the next day. Hassan picked me up from my hotel early in the morning. The drive was long, but the scenery was breathtaking. We passed through small towns and vast stretches of desert. Everything seemed normal until we left the main road and took a dirt path leading into the middle of nowhere. I asked Hassan where we were going, and he said it was a shortcut. But as the drive continued, I started to feel uneasy. There were no other cars, no signs of civilization. Just endless desert. When we finally stopped, we were in front of an old, run-down building. Hassan's demeanor changed. He was no longer friendly. He pulled out a knife and told me to get out of the car. My heart pounded in my chest as I did what he said. He tied my hands and led me inside the building. It was dark and smelled of mold. He pushed me into a small room and locked the door. I was terrified. I had no idea what he planned to do with me. I sat on the cold floor, trying to calm down and think. There was a small window high up on the wall, but it was barred. The door was heavy and solid. I knew I had to escape, but I didn't know how. Hours passed. Hassan came back with some food and water. He told me not to try anything stupid, then left again. I ate quickly, trying to gather my strength. I noticed a rusty nail on the floor. It was small, but it was something. I used it to start working on the ropes around my wrists. It took a long time, but I finally managed to loosen the knots. My wrists were sore and bloody, but I was free. I waited until nightfall, hoping Hassan would fall asleep. The building was silent, except for the occasional creak and the sound of the wind outside. I carefully approached the door and listened. No sound from the other side. I tried the handle, but it was locked. I remembered the nail and started working on the lock. It was difficult, and my hands were shaking, but after what felt like hours, I heard a click. The door opened slightly. I peered out. The hallway was dark and empty. I moved silently, trying to remember the way we came in. I found the main room and saw Hassan sleeping on a couch, a knife on a table next to him. My heart raced. I needed to get out without waking him. I crept past him and made it to the front door. It was unlocked. I stepped outside and felt the cool night air on my face. I wanted to run, but I didn't know where to go. The car was still there, but I didn't have the keys. I decided to head towards the main road, hoping to find help. I walked for what seemed like hours. The desert was disorienting in the dark, but I kept moving. Just as the first light of dawn appeared, I saw headlights in the distance. A truck was coming towards me. I waved frantically, praying they would stop. The truck slowed down and pulled over. A kind-looking older man got out and asked if I was okay. I explained what had happened, and he let me use his phone to call the police. They arrived quickly and took me back to Marrakesh. Hassan was arrested, and I was safe. I will never forget that experience. Traveling through South America had always been a dream of mine. I had saved up for years and finally took the plunge. I started in Argentina, making my way through Chile, Peru, and then Colombia. Each country had its own charm, and I felt more alive than I had in years. I arrived in Colombia with high spirits. The people were friendly, the food was amazing, and the scenery was breathtaking. I spent a few days in Bogota before heading to Medellin. It was there that I met a group of locals. They seemed nice, always smiling and inviting me to join them for drinks and meals. We quickly became friends. One evening, they suggested a trip to a secluded part of the jungle. They said it was a hidden gem, a place tourists never see. They promised waterfalls, exotic wildlife, and an authentic experience. I was hesitant but also intrigued. I agreed to go. We set out early the next morning. The group consisted of Juan, the leader, along with Carlos, Maria, and a few others. They seemed excited and kept the mood light with jokes and laughter. We took a jeep deep into the jungle, far from any towns or cities. The road was rough, but the scenery was beautiful. After a few hours, we arrived at a small clearing. Juan said we would need to hike the rest of the way. We grabbed our backpacks and set up on foot. The trail was narrow and overgrown, but Juan assured us it was the right way. The deeper we went, the more uneasy I felt. The jungle was dense, and the sounds of wildlife were all around us. We walked for what felt like hours. The sun was starting to set, and I was beginning to worry. I asked Juan how much farther it was, and he just smiled and said we were close. We finally reached a small campsite with a few makeshift huts. Juan said this was where we would spend the night. As we settled in, I noticed that Carlos and Maria were whispering to each other, occasionally glancing in my direction. My unease grew, but I tried to shake it off. We sat around a campfire, and Juan passed around a bottle of local liquor. I took a sip, but my nerves were too afraid to enjoy it. When it got dark, the atmosphere changed. Juan's friendly demeanor vanished. He and the others became quiet, almost tense. I felt trapped. Suddenly, Juan stood up and walked over to me. He looked down with a cold, hard stare. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and threatening. Before I could react, Carlos and another man grabbed me, forcing me to my feet. They dragged me to one of the huts and threw me inside. I hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of me. They locked the door from the outside, leaving me in darkness. Panic set in. I banged on the door, shouting for help, but no one responded. I tried to think of a way out. The walls of the hut were thin, made of wooden planks. I started to kick at them, hoping to break through. After several tries, one of the planks gave way, creating a small hole. I squeezed through, scratching my arms and tearing my shirt. Once outside, I saw that the campfire was still burning, but the group was nowhere in sight. I needed to get away fast. I remembered the trail we took and decided to follow it back. I ran through the jungle, my heart pounding in my chest. The sounds of the night were deafening. I stumbled over roots and rocks, cutting my hands and knees. I heard voices behind me, shouting in Spanish. They were coming after me. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the pain and fear. I had to find the jeep and get out of there. The jungle seemed endless, but I kept going. Finally, I saw the clearing ahead. The jeep was still there, parked where we left it. I reached the jeep and yanked the door open. The keys were still in the ignition. I jumped in and started the engine, praying it would start. The Jeep roared to life, and I floored the gas pedal, speeding down the dirt road. In the rearview mirror, I saw one and the others burst from the trees, shouting and waving their arms. They were too late. I drove as fast as I could, not daring to slow down until I was far away. When I finally reached a town, I went straight to the police. They took my statement and sent officers to the jungle, but I never found out what happened to Juan and his group. I left Colombia the next day, shaken but relieved to be alive. The experience haunts me to this day. I had trusted those people, thinking they were friends. It was a harsh lesson about trust and the dangers that can lurk behind friendly faces. I was studying abroad in Japan, living in a small apartment near my university in Tokyo. Everything about the place was new and exciting. I loved exploring the city, trying new foods, and learning the language. It was a dream come true. One night, I decided to take a walk to clear my head after a long day of classes. I wandered through narrow streets, admiring the old buildings mixed with modern shops. It started to rain lightly, and I pulled up my hood, enjoying the cool air. As I turned a corner, I found myself in a dimly lit alley. I was about to turn back when I saw a group of men gathered around a car. They were speaking in hushed tones, their faces serious. Something about the scene felt off, so I ducked behind a dumpster to watch. The men exchanged briefcases, and one of them opened his to show stacks of money. I realized with a jolt that I was witnessing something I shouldn't. My heart pounded in my chest. I had heard stories about the Yakuza, and I knew enough to recognize that this was one of their deals. I tried to back away slowly, but I accidentally knocked over a can. The clatter was deafening in the silence. The men snapped their heads in my direction, their eyes narrowing. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing in the alley. I heard them shouting behind me, and I knew they were coming after me. I didn't know the area well enough to navigate the back streets, but I ran anyway, hoping to lose them. The rain was coming down harder now, making the pavement slick. I turned down another alley, but it was a dead end. Panic surged through me as I looked for a way out. I spotted a fire escape and scrambled up it, my hands slipping on the wet metal. I could hear the men getting closer, their voices angry and threatening. I reached the roof and tried to catch my breath. I looked around for a place to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The roof was flat and exposed. I could see the men climbing up the fire escape, their shadows stretching out in the dim light. Desperation took over, and I jumped to the next building, barely making it. I stumbled and fell, scraping my hands and knees. I got up and kept running, not daring to look back. I needed to find a safe place, somewhere I could hide until they gave up. I saw a door on the rooftop and tried the handle. It was locked. I pounded on it, praying someone would hear me. The door finally opened, and an elderly man looked out, startled. I didn't have time to explain. I pushed past him and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. I could hear the men outside, shouting and banging on the door. The old man looked terrified, but I begged him not to say anything. He nodded and pointed to a small storage room. I hid inside, trying to control my breathing. I heard the men break down the door and search the building. They were thorough, checking every room and corner. I held my breath, hoping they wouldn't find me. After what felt like an eternity, they finally left. I waited a while longer before coming out. The old man was gone, probably too scared to stay. I thanked him silently and made my way back to my apartment, sticking to crowded streets and well-lit areas. I kept looking over my shoulder, afraid they might still be following me. When I got home, I locked all the doors and windows. I couldn't stop shaking. I knew I had to report what happened, but I was terrified. The Yakuza were known for their brutality, and I didn't want to become their next target. I eventually went to the police and told them everything. They assured me they would investigate, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I changed my routine, avoided going out at night, and stayed close to friends. The rest of my time in Japan was overshadowed by fear. I finished my studies and returned home as soon as I could. The experience left me traumatized, but I was grateful to be alive. I was on a business trip to Russia, staying in Moscow for a week to finalize a deal with a local company. The trip started off well. I met my contacts, attended meetings, and even had some time to explore the city. Everything seemed to be going smoothly. On the fourth day, I had a meeting scheduled with one of the company's executives at a high-end restaurant. We discussed the final details of the deal over dinner. The food was great, and the conversation was friendly. After we finished, I thanked him and headed back to my hotel. The next morning, I woke up to loud knocking on my hotel room door. I opened it to find two police officers standing there. They were speaking in rapid Russian, and I struggled to understand. One of them handed me a piece of paper. It was an arrest warrant. My heart started racing. They were accusing me of theft, saying I had stolen valuable documents from the company. I tried to explain that there must be some mistake, that I hadn't taken anything, but they didn't seem to care. They handcuffed me and took me to the police station. I felt a mix of fear and confusion. How could this be happening? At the station, they put me in a small, cold cell. I kept trying to tell them I was innocent, but no one listened. I was allowed one phone call, so I called my company back in the States. They were shocked and promised to contact the American embassy. Hours passed before I was taken to an interrogation room. A stern-looking officer sat across from me, asking questions through a translator. He wanted to know where I had hidden the documents. I insisted I didn't know anything about them, but he kept pressing. The atmosphere was tense, and I could feel the weight of the situation crushing me. I was thrown back into the cell, my mind racing. I thought about the dinner, the conversations, trying to remember anything that might help. Then it hit me, the executive. He had seemed too friendly, almost eager to finalize the deal. Was it possible he had set me up? The next day, a lawyer from the embassy came to see me. He was sympathetic but didn't seem hopeful. He explained that the legal system here was difficult to navigate, especially for foreigners. Corruption was rampant, and proving my innocence would be an uphill battle. Days turned into weeks. I was moved to a larger prison, sharing a cell with other inmates. Some were kind, others not so much. The food was terrible, and the conditions were harsh. I kept thinking about my family back home, wondering if I would ever see them again. The lawyer worked tirelessly, digging into the case. He managed to find out that the documents had indeed been stolen, but there was no solid evidence linking me to the crime. It was all based on the executive's testimony. I felt a glimmer of hope, but it was quickly overshadowed by the reality of my situation. One night, I was woken up by a guard. He told me I had a visitor. It was the lawyer again, looking more serious than ever. He said they had found something, a security camera footage from the restaurant. It showed the executive slipping something into my bag while I wasn't looking. This was the break we needed. The lawyer presented the footage in court, along with other evidence showing my innocence. It was a slow process, but the judge finally agreed to review the case. The executive was called in for questioning, and his story started to fall apart under scrutiny. After what felt like an eternity, I was finally released. The charges were dropped, and I was free to go. I couldn't believe it. The nightmare was over, but I felt exhausted and broken. I thanked the lawyer and everyone who had helped me, and I made my way to the airport. On the flight back home, I couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. It was a terrifying experience, one that I wouldn't wish on anyone. My name is Molly, and I thought you saw that I'm going to take a trip to Greece alone. My life was getting boring, and I had some money saved, plus it was something I had always wanted to do, and I finally had the chance. The first few days were perfect. I explored Athens, visited the Acropolis, and enjoyed the local food. It was everything I hoped for and more. One morning, I woke up in my small hotel room, ready for another day of adventure. But when I looked around, I noticed something was off. My bag, which I had left on the chair, was gone. I checked the room thoroughly, thinking maybe I had misplaced it, but it was nowhere to be found. Panic set in. My passport, wallet, phone, everything was in that bag. I had no way to prove who I was or contact anyone for help. I went to the hotel reception, trying to stay calm. The receptionist looked concerned and called the local police for me. The police arrived and took my statement. They seemed sympathetic but not very hopeful. They told me that thefts like this were common in tourist areas. They advised me to go to the embassy to get a temporary passport. I thanked them and tried to stay positive, even though I felt completely lost. I walked to the American embassy, my heart racing. When I got there, I explained my situation to the staff. They asked for some details and filled out some forms. They said it would take a few days to process everything. I nodded, trying to hold back my frustration and fear. Without any money or identification, I had to rely on the embassy's resources. They gave me some cash and helped me find a new place to stay. It was a small hostel, not far from the embassy. I felt grateful but also vulnerable. Over the next few days, I stayed mostly in the hostel, too scared to venture far. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every noise made me jump, every shadow seemed threatening. I kept checking in with the embassy, hoping for some good news. One night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard footsteps outside my room. My heart pounded in my chest. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I slowly got up and crept to the door, peeking through the peephole. There was no one there. The next day, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I needed to get out of the hostel, even just for a little while. As I walked through the streets, I felt a strange sensation, like I was being followed. I glanced over my shoulder, but no one seemed suspicious. I turned into a small cafe, hoping to find some comfort in a cup of coffee. As I sat there, I noticed a man at a nearby table, staring at me. He looked away when I met his gaze, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. I quickly finished my coffee and left. On my way back to the hostel, I felt the same unease. I walked faster, constantly looking around. When I got back, I locked the door and tried to calm down. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. The next morning, I went to the embassy again. They told me my temporary passport was ready. Relief washed over me. I could finally go home. They arranged for a taxi to take me to the airport. As I packed my things, I couldn't wait to leave Greece and this nightmare behind. At the airport, I kept looking over my shoulder, afraid that someone might try to stop me. But everything went smoothly. I boarded the plane, took my seat, and let out a sigh of relief as the plane took off. I was finally going home, The whole experience left me shaken. I loved Greece, but the fear and anxiety I felt overshadowed everything else. Exploring the outback had always been a dream of mine. After a few days in Sydney, I rented a car and drove out into the vast wilderness. The scenery was breathtaking, with red dirt roads stretching out to the horizon and the occasional kangaroo hopping by. It felt like an adventure I had always wanted. One afternoon, I pulled over at a small roadside stop to stretch my legs. As I was getting back into my car, an old pickup truck pulled up beside me. The driver was a middle-aged man with a friendly smile. He struck up a conversation, asking where I was headed. We chatted for a bit, and he offered to show me a shortcut to a beautiful, secluded spot he said tourists rarely visited. I hesitated, but he seemed genuine enough, so I agreed to follow him. We drove for about an hour, further and further away from the main road. The landscape became more desolate, and I started feeling uneasy. Finally, he pulled over and signaled for me to do the same. I got out of my car, and he pointed to a dirt track leading into the bush. "Just a short walk that way," he said, "and you'll find a hidden gem." I thanked him and walked down the track as he drove away. After a few minutes, I realized I couldn't see the road anymore. There was no hidden gem, just endless bushland. Panic set in when I tried to retrace my steps and found the path had disappeared. I was alone in the middle of nowhere. I shouted for help, but there was no response. My phone had no signal, and I had no idea which direction to go. Hours passed as I wandered, the sun beating down on me. I regretted not bringing more water. My mouth was dry, and I could feel the first signs of dehydration setting in. As night fell, the temperature dropped. I found a spot under a tree and tried to rest, but every sound made me jump. The rustling of leaves, the distant calls of animals, everything seemed like a threat. I barely slept, my mind racing with thoughts of how I had been so easily fooled. In the morning, I decided to keep walking, hoping to find some sign of civilization. My legs were sore, and my feet were blistered, but I pushed on. Around midday, I stumbled upon an old, abandoned shack. It looked like it had been empty for years, but I went inside, desperate for shelter. The shack provided little comfort. The roof leaked, and the floor was covered in dirt and debris. I found an old, rusted canteen and hoped there was still water in it. It tasted foul, but I drank it anyway. I needed to stay alive. Days passed in a blur. I rationed the little water I had and ate whatever scraps I could find. I kept hoping someone would find me, but no one came. My strength was fading, and I knew I couldn't last much longer. On the 5th day, I heard a noise outside the shack. I crawled to the door and saw a figure in the distance. Summoning all my remaining energy, I shouted for help. The figure turned and started running towards me. As they got closer, I saw it was a young woman with a backpack. She looked shocked to see me. She gave me water and food, and I told her my story. She was a backpacker, like me, and had gotten lost while hiking. We decided to stick together and try to find our way back. With her help, we navigated through the bush, finding signs of a trail. After 2 days, we stumbled upon a ranger station. The rangers were surprised to see us and quickly provided medical attention. They contacted the local authorities, and I was taken to a nearby hospital to recover. As I lay in the hospital bed, I reflected on my ordeal. The friendly local who had abandoned me was nowhere to be found. The ranger said it wasn't the first time something like this had happened. I was grateful to be alive, but the experience had changed me. I eventually made it back home, safe but scarred. The outback was no longer the adventure I had dreamed of. It was a harsh, unforgiving place that had nearly taken my life. I went to Kenya to volunteer in a rural village, hoping to make a difference. I joined a small organization that promised to help with education and healthcare. The people were welcoming, and I felt like I was doing something good. The village was peaceful, surrounded by green hills and dusty roads. After a few weeks, I started noticing strange things. The head of the organization, Mark, kept asking questions about my family and whether anyone knew exactly where I was. I shrugged it off at first, thinking he was just making conversation. But it got more intense. One night, he invited me to his office. He said there was an important meeting, but when I arrived, it was just him. He offered me a drink, which I politely declined. He insisted, but I stood my ground. His smile faded, replaced by a cold stare. He started talking about how dangerous the area could be for someone like me, alone and far from home. His words felt more like a threat than a warning. I left the office, my heart racing. The next day, I decided to dig a little deeper. I talked to some of the villagers and a few other volunteers. They were reluctant to say much, but I picked up on their unease. There were rumors about people disappearing, about volunteers who suddenly left without saying goodbye. I felt a knot in my stomach. One evening, I saw Mark and a few other staff members loading crates into a truck. Something about their behavior was off. They were too secretive, too hurried. I waited until they left, then sneaked over to the truck and peeked inside one of the crates. What I found made my blood run cold. Passports, IDs, and personal belongings of people who were supposed to have left the village. I realized then that I was in serious danger. I had to get out, but I needed a plan. I couldn't just leave without raising suspicion. I spent the next day pretending everything was normal, but my mind was racing. I knew Mark and his people would notice if I tried to leave. That night, I packed a small bag with essentials and waited until everyone was asleep. I snuck out of my hut, careful not to make any noise. The village was dark and quiet. I headed towards the edge of the village, where there was a small path leading into the hills. As I was making my way out, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see one of Mark's men, Paul, walking towards me. He called my name, his voice low and threatening. I didn't answer. I started to run. Paul chased me, shouting for me to stop. My heart pounded in my chest. I could barely see where I was going in the dark. I stumbled over rocks and roots, but I kept running. I had to get away. I ran for what felt like hours, my lungs burning, my legs aching. I finally reached a small river. I waded through it, hoping the water would cover my tracks. On the other side, I found a dense patch of bushes and hid there, trying to catch my breath. I stayed hidden until dawn. When the sun came up, I carefully made my way through the hills, staying up the main paths. I knew I had to find help, but I was deep in the countryside, far from any towns. I walked for 2 days, living off the little food I had packed and drinking from streams. On the 3rd day, I stumbled upon a small village. The people there were kind and offered me food and water. I told them I was lost, but I didn't mention the organization or what had happened. I was too scared to trust anyone. They helped me get to the nearest town, where I found a police station. I reported what I had seen, but I could tell the officers were skeptical. A foreigner coming in with a wild story about human trafficking? They took my statement but didn't seem to take it seriously. I contacted my family and arranged for a flight back home. When I finally boarded the plane, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I was safe, but the experience left me shaken. Back home, I reported the organization to international authorities. It took months, but eventually they were investigated and shut down. I never heard what happened to Mark or his men, but I hope they face justice. The whole experience changed me. I went to Kenya thinking I would help others, but I ended up fighting for my own life. I still believe in volunteering and helping those in need, but I'm much more cautious now. I learned the hard way that not everyone who claims to do good is actually good. I was on a cycling tour through the French countryside, enjoying the peaceful roads and beautiful landscapes. It was my dream trip, and I had been planning it for months. I started early each day, pedaling through small villages and fields of sunflowers. Everything was going perfectly until that one day when everything changed. I was about 20 kilometers from the nearest town when I noticed a group of men in an old van driving slowly behind me. At first, I thought they were just being cautious, but they stayed there, always keeping a distance but never passing. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to ignore it, telling myself they were just locals on a slow drive. After a while, they drove ahead and parked at the side of the road. As I passed, I glanced over and saw them watching me closely. Their stares were intense, and I felt a knot form in my stomach. I kept cycling, trying to appear calm, but my mind was racing. I needed to reach the next town quickly. A few kilometers later, I saw the van again, parked at a different spot. This time, one of the men was outside, leaning against the van, smoking a cigarette. He looked at me with a sinister grin as I rode past. My heart started pounding. I had no doubt now that they were following me. I decided to take a detour, hoping to lose them. I turned onto a narrow side road that wound through a dense forest. The road was rough and slowed me down, but I hoped it would be enough to shake them off. For a while, I didn't see them, and I started to feel a glimmer of hope. But then, I heard the sound of an engine behind me. I glanced back and saw the van coming down the road. Panic set in. I pedaled as fast as I could, my legs burning, but the van kept getting closer. The road was too narrow for them to drive fast, which was my only advantage. I saw a small path leading into the forest and decided to take it. I hoped the trees would provide some cover. I jumped off my bike, grabbed it, and ran into the woods. The ground was uneven, making it hard to move quickly. I kept going, trying to put as much distance between me and the van as possible. After a few minutes, I heard voices behind me. The men were following me on foot. I ducked behind a thick tree, trying to catch my breath without making a sound. The forest was dense, and the light was fading. I hoped the darkness would hide me. I heard them talking in French, their voices getting closer. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid they would hear it. I stayed as still as possible, barely daring to breathe. They were only a few meters away now, and I could see their flashlights sweeping through the trees. One of them stopped near my hiding spot, shining his light around. I pressed myself against the tree, praying he wouldn't see me. After what felt like an eternity, he moved on, following the others deeper into the forest. I waited until their voices faded before moving again. I needed to get out of there and find help. I knew the nearest town was still several kilometers away, and it was getting dark. I carefully made my way through the forest, trying to stay off the path. Every sound made me jump, but I kept going, driven by fear. Eventually, I found a small clearing and saw a farmhouse in the distance. It was my only hope. I ran towards it, hoping the people inside would help me. When I reached the house, I banged on the door, desperate. An old man opened the door, looking surprised to see me. I quickly explained what was happening, my French broken and frantic. He nodded and ushered me inside, locking the door behind me. His wife brought me some water, and they listened as I told them everything. The old man called the local police, explaining the situation. They told us to stay inside and that they would send someone as soon as possible. The wait was agonizing, every minute feeling like an hour. I kept looking out the window, expecting to see them in any moment. Finally, after what felt like forever, the police arrived. They searched the area and found the van abandoned on the side of the road. There was no sign of a man, but the police assured me they would continue to look for them. They escorted me to the nearest town, where I stayed in a small hotel. I spent the night in a state of constant fear, jumping at every sound. The next morning, I decided to cut my trip short and head back home. The police never found the men, and I never found out why they were following me. But the experience left me shaken. I still love cycling, but now I'm much more cautious about where I go and who I trust. The French countryside is beautiful, but it hides its dangers well. I was lucky to escape. I'll never forget the terror of that day. I was staying at a small, cheap hostel in Bangkok, trying to make my trip to Thailand as budget-friendly as possible. The place was run down but had a certain charm, with a common area where travelers would gather to share stories. That's where I met Sarah. Sarah seemed friendly and approachable, a fellow traveler from Australia. We clicked immediately, bonding over our love of adventure and exploring new places. She had been traveling through Southeast Asia for a few months and had lots of tips and recommendations. We decided to explore the city together, and I felt lucky to have found a travel buddy so quickly. We spent the next few days visiting temples, markets, and street food stalls. Sarah knew all the best spots, and it felt like having a personal tour guide. One evening, she suggested we visit a lesser-known night market outside the tourist areas. She said it was a hidden gem, with the best food and unique souvenirs. We took a tuk-tuk to the market, and as we wandered through the stalls, I noticed it was much quieter than the bustling markets in the city center. Sarah led the way, guiding me through narrow alleys until we reached a small, dimly lit bar. She suggested we go in for a drink, and though I was a bit hesitant, I followed her. The bar was nearly empty, just a few locals and a couple of other foreigners. We sat at a table near the back, and Sarah ordered drinks for us. As we chatted, I started feeling a bit lightheaded. I chalked it up to the heat and the long day of walking, but then my vision began to blur. I looked at Sarah, trying to tell her something was wrong, but she just smiled and kept talking. My head felt heavy, and I struggled to stay awake. I realized too late that something was very wrong. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Sarah's cold, calculating expression. When I woke up, I was in a dark, cold room. My hands and feet were tied, and my head was pounding. Panic set in as I tried to remember what happened. I could hear muffled voices outside the door, speaking in a language I didn't understand. I struggled against the ropes, but they were too tight. The door creaked open, and a man stepped in, his face hidden in shadows. He spoke to me in broken English, telling me to stay quiet and that everything would be over soon. My heart raced as I realized I had been kidnapped. I asked about Sarah, but the man just laughed and left the room. I spent what felt like hours in that room, fear gripping me with every passing minute. Eventually, the door opened again, and two men came in. They untied my feet and dragged me out into a dimly lit hallway. I was too weak to fight back, my body still recovering from whatever they had drugged me with. They led me into a larger room that looked like an old, abandoned medical facility. My stomach churned as I saw surgical equipment and bloodstains on the floor. I realized with horror that they were planning to harvest my organs. Desperation gave me a surge of strength. I struggled and screamed, trying to break free. One of the men punched me in the stomach, and I doubled over in pain. They strapped me to a table, and I felt tears streaming down my face. I couldn't believe this was happening. Just as they were preparing to sedate me again, I heard a commotion outside. Shouts and banging echoed through the building. The men exchanged worried glances, and one of them left the room to check what was happening. The remaining men hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do. The door burst open, and a group of police officers stormed in. The man beside me tried to run, but he was quickly subdued. The officers untied me and helped me off the table, speaking calmly and reassuringly. They told me I was safe now, and that they had been tracking this organ trafficking ring for months. I was taken to a hospital, where I was treated for my injuries and monitored for any lasting effects of the drugs. The police explained that they had been tipped off by another traveler who had a close call with Sarah but managed to escape. They had been following her and finally found the hideout. Sarah and the men were arrested, and I was able to return home safely. The experience left me traumatized, and I struggled with nightmares for a long time. But I was grateful to be alive and determined to be more cautious in the future. Traveling is supposed to be about adventure and discovery, but I learned the hard way that not everyone you meet has good intentions. I'm still passionate about exploring the world, but now I'm much more careful about who I trust. I was on a road trip through Central Europe, driving alone through the Hungarian countryside. The scenery was beautiful, with rolling hills and fields stretching out as far as I could see. It was late afternoon, and I planned to reach Budapest by nightfall. I had been on the road for hours, and I was looking forward to a good meal and a bed. The road was nearly empty, with only the occasional car passing by. I felt a sense of calm, enjoying the solitude and the quiet. The weather was perfect, with clear skies and a cool breeze. I had the windows down, letting the fresh air fill the car. I noticed a van ahead, pulled over to the side of the road with its hazard lights on. As I got closer, I saw a man standing next to it, waving his arms. He looked distressed, and I felt a pang of concern. I slowed down and pulled over, figuring I could at least see if he needed help. I rolled down my window and asked if everything was okay. The man spoke quickly in Hungarian, which I didn't understand, but his tone was urgent. He gestured toward the van, and I saw a woman inside, holding a small child. I nodded and got out of the car, wanting to see if I could help. As soon as I stepped out, I felt a sharp pain in the back of my head. Everything went black for a moment, and when I came to, I was on the ground. I tried to get up, but my head was spinning. I saw 3 men standing around me, one of them holding a gun. They were speaking rapidly, their voices harsh and angry. One of the men grabbed me by the arm and dragged me to my feet. He pushed me against my car, and I felt the cold metal of the gun pressed against my back. I tried to speak, to tell them to take whatever they wanted, but my voice came out as a croak. The man with the gun barked an order, and one of the others rifled through my pockets, taking my wallet and phone. They shoved me into the back seat of my car and got in, with the man holding the gun sitting next to me. I could feel his eyes on me, the barrel of the gun pressed against my side. The car started moving, and I had no idea where they were taking me. I tried to stay calm, to think of a way out, but my mind was racing. The countryside blurred past the windows, and I felt a rising sense of panic. The men were talking to each other in low voices, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. After what felt like an eternity, the car pulled off the main road and onto a narrow, bumpy track. We drove for a few more minutes before coming to a stop in front of an old, abandoned farmhouse. They dragged me out of the car and pushed me inside, the door slamming shut behind us. The interior of the farmhouse was dark and musty, with broken furniture and debris scattered across the floor. They shoved me into a chair and tied my hands behind my back, the rope cutting into my wrists. One of the men stood guard while the others went through my belongings, taking anything of value. I could hear them arguing, their voices growing louder and more heated. I didn't know what they were saying, but it was clear they were not happy. The man with the gun glanced over at me, his eyes cold and calculating. I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew I had to do something, but I was terrified. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. I remembered the Swiss Army knife I kept in the glove compartment of my car, and I hoped they hadn't found it. If I could just get to it, I might have a chance. The men seemed distracted, still arguing amongst themselves. I tested the ropes, trying to see if there was any give. They were tight, but I felt a slight looseness in one of the knots. I worked at it slowly, trying not to draw attention to myself. After what felt like hours, I managed to free one of my hands. I kept it hidden, waiting for the right moment. The men were still distracted, and I knew this was my only chance. I took a deep breath and sprang to my feet, shoving the chair into the man with the gun. He stumbled back, and I ran for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I burst outside and headed for the car, hoping they hadn't taken the keys. I could hear them shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. I threw open the car door and reached into the glove compartment, my fingers closing around the knife. The men were almost on me, and I slashed wildly, keeping them at bay. I jumped into the driver's seat and turned the key, the engine roaring to life. I floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning on the loose gravel before catching traction. The car lurched forward, and I sped down the track, not daring to look back. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I kept driving, not caring where I was going, just wanting to put as much distance between me and those men as possible. The narrow track eventually led back to the main road, and I headed towards the nearest town, praying I would find help. I reached a small village and pulled into a gas station. The attendant looked up in surprise as I stumbled out of the car, my clothes torn and bloodied. I managed to explain what had happened, and he called the police. The police arrived quickly, and I gave them my statement. They assured me they would search for the men, but I could tell they didn't hold out much hope. They arranged for a tow truck to take my car, and one of the officers gave me a ride to a nearby hotel. That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep. The events of the day replayed in my mind. It's the experience I won't forget anytime soon.